You guys ready to go get back into API stuff?
Let's do it. We got
45?
minutes.
Okay. All right. So I actually have a whole other segment that I sometimes cover when it comes to when I have a whole other segment about tools and publishing, but we kind of jumped into that a lot yesterday. And a lot of it's not really that specific to APIs. But I do have a different presentation where I talk about some of these API platforms that you could use to host Doc. We talked about Swagger UI and Swagger Hub. README.io is one worth checking out if you want a third-party hosting. It's a really nice site. It gives you a lot of visual design tools. It's quite popular. Another one is called Spectacle. I'm just briefly mentioning these. Spectacle is a free open source project. You feed it in OpenAPI definition and it spits out a layout like this. One drawback is that you can't add any non-reference files or other tutorial files, so it's kind of a one-trick pony there. And then API-Matic has some interesting stuff. They give you a little drop-down menu to jump to different tools or different languages so that developers, get code that's very customized to them. Haven't used that. And finally, one other called RESTlet Studio. It seems pretty robust and it also has visual modeling tools. So this is kind of similar to the Stoplight UI where you've got a way to describe things in the UI. There's a ton of tools in this space. Some might work for you, some might not. You could always code things by hand, right? It's your choice. But this is just a taste of it. And if you want more info on this, look on my site. You'll find a recorded presentation and so forth. Now, this last section, I'm calling non-reference content in docs. And a lot of times when people talk about API documentation, they sort of only cover the reference stuff because it's highly specific to APIs. You've got structure and you've got definitions and standards. But in all reality, the reference stuff, a lot of times the engineers create it because it's easy to write. There's known parameters. There's known fields. There's known things. It's a form essentially that they fill out. The hard part is the tutorial, the conceptual, the non-reference content. These could be guides, how-to tasks, really how to use the API in a real scenario, doing different contexts, or how do you code things like code tutorials. So, and this is often where technical writers spend more of their time, right? So you may be thinking, well, why did I spend all the time doing reference stuff? Well, anyway. There's only so much one can say about the non-reference stuff because a lot of times it's specific to the API. But here are some general sections that are common and are more specific to API docs that you'll probably want. So when you're thinking about, oh, what else do I need? I've got my reference stuff set. Consider these 11 topics. 1, an overview, and I'll dive into each of these. This is an overview. Getting started, authentication, status and error codes, rate limiting, code samples and tutorials, SDKs and sample apps, a quick reference, best practices with the API, a glossary, and an FAQ. If you had all these in your documentation, it would be awesome. A lot of times, you know how it is. You're lucky if you have barely enough to make it coherent. But yeah. And I've got more information on this on my site. But let's dive into each of these. And after we're done, we'll try to enter some more discussions about things. But again, if you have questions, let's chat about them when you have them. The API overview is usually the homepage of your API docs. And you explain in a big picture way what your API does. Most APIs, I have a quote here, most APIs, they fail because of this overview, essentially. This is a quote from the top 20 reasons startups fail by Treehouse Logic. They say, startups fail when they're not solving a market problem, We were not solving a large enough problem that we could universally serve with a scalable solution. We had great technology, great data on shopping behavior, great reputation as a thought leader, great expertise, great advisors, etc. But what we didn't have was technology or business model that solved a pain point in a scalable way. So your overview needs to describe the pain point that your business model solves. What is your API? What does it do? What is it for? Why should I use it? Because for every API that's out there, there's probably half a dozen others that do something very similar. And I'm sure you know this and observe this, but when you're in a project, people sort of become immune to the purpose and the larger point of the product and just assume that people know what it's for, that what it's used for. And pretty soon you have a whole set of documentation with no clear idea of what it even does or what it solves. It just dives right into the technical details. These are the endpoints, this is this. It's like, well, wait a minute, what is this thing for? And this larger perspective is often why these fail. Like people are choosing, customers are choosing, developers are trying to figure out what API to use for different services. And if they can't figure it out from reading your doc overview, they might just skip it. So this is a good page. It's often overlooked. And let's look at an example. Let's look at SendGrid while we have the SendGrid person here. Actually, I use their API as an example for a lot of things, but this is a particularly good one. What is SendGrid, right? If I just look at the name, I have no idea that it is related to email. I mean, a grid could be anything, really. But they define what it is, who it's for, and do it fairly briefly. You know, you create marketing campaigns with it. It's an API for sending email or something. It's very well done. Let's look at one more. Lyft. You may think, a Lyft API? Well, everybody knows Lyft, right? Except for, no, they're not going to start with that assumption. Instead, they're like, what is Lyft? And they define it. And, you know, hey, if you are totally unfamiliar with Lyft, here's more information. Why use Lyft? They even provide a glossary, which is, you know, always welcome. So this is the homepage, and definitely it should have that. All right, next section, getting started. This is a core topic that you always want in your API. Again, this can be forgotten, but it's very helpful. In programming, like how-to books, you often have a hello world tutorial. And this tutorial is the quickest way to get something up and running and like an output, a very minimal output from beginning to end. How you set up your environment and you make this call and you compile it and you get the output. Well, the getting started is doing that same thing but with your API. Good API docs have this, bad ones don't. So here's an example of getting started with PayPal. And this is it says, hey, look, first you have to get your authorization tokens. Here's some quick requests and so forth. This is a sample request that you make, some sample parameters. So you might pick out like one of your API endpoints that you want and just have somebody plug it in and see how it works. A lot of times they want to do a test just so they can make sure they're authorizing it and it's working. There's some other really fascinating ones from Twilio that we'll dive into later, but let's look at one more. How about IBM Cloud? After their intro and their first pages, they've got getting started with Watson and IBM Cloud. Number 1, you need an account. Number 2, find the service you want. They do get negative points for an animated GIF in here, but that's all right. Just kidding. 2 animated GIFs at the same time. Wow, I'm about ready to, have vertigo. But creating a project, step 3. And next step. So you want to hold the user's hand, get them going in a very simple way. Actually, on the topic of videos, most developers dislike videos, but the one scenario where they work well are when people are starting from ground zero. And so in a getting started tutorial, it can be on the ball. And this is probably the speed and the length of a video that developers will tolerate. A 5-second looping video on hyper speed. Anyway, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Okay, getting started is great because really you need this as a technical writer, or we need this as a technical writer. When you have an API that people may dump a bunch of information on you, you need to test it, you have to get started. You have to go through these steps. So you can just document what you're doing. The run and postman button, we covered this, but this is a great thing that you can add to help people get started right away. Won't go back over this. And there's even an acronym for measuring the time it takes. You could maybe do usability around this and say, hey, Joe or Sally programmer, we want you to go through this Hello World tutorial and see how long it takes you to complete it and time it. And if you have a good API, maybe you can do this in 5 minutes. But if it takes you 5 hours, well, it level sets, some expectations around it. But you can put some metrics and usability around it. All right, authorization and authentication. I remember we had this somewhere. There's a difference between the two, and this is one of the most important parts of your API docs. But there's a difference between the two. The authentication is, are you who you say you are? Whereas authorization is, are you, who we now know, allowed to do this action? So somebody could be authorized. For example, when I log into README, it knows me, but then it rejects any ability for me to do anything because my trial has expired. So that's the difference between the two. But your authorization, generally APIs have several different ways that you can authorize things. The most simple is an API key. If you have an API key, just consider yourself lucky because it's very simple to document. Essentially, an API key is a token that is passed in the header of your request that has a big, long alphanumeric string. It's encrypted and so forth as it travels across the wires and hits the API. The API validates the token, says, yes, this is a good API key. We'll go ahead and give you access. An example from SendGrid as well. The API key is used where super robust security may not be absolutely necessary. Another very common one, or less common one, actually, is HMAC. HMAC, oh man, this thing always escapes me. Hashed something, application something. All right, what it is a key that is hashed. And here's how it works. I've tried to diagram. This is actually my diagram attempting to do this. I worked at a place where we did HMAC, and every different API endpoint had a different HMAC key. So not only did you have to do it for one, like every single endpoint needed its own. It was quite a frustrating thing. The idea is you've got a message combined with a key that produces a signature. And this key is known to you, or the developer, or the app, and it's known to the server. The server has the same key. When this message, the signature, travels to the server uses the same key to decrypt it and check out that it's a correct signature. Now, you would never have to describe this process to a user. Usually people don't want you to even know the inner workings of security, but you might just have to explain that, oh, this is the HMAC authorization model, and this is your key, and this is how you generate this signature, which then you'll have to put into your requests. All right. Another very common one is OAuth. OAuth, you've all used this, no doubt, when you're prompted to log in to a site using Google or Twitter or Facebook. Basically, OAuth has a separate authentication server separate from your API. So let's say this top part is your app. Your app first makes a request into this authentication server, and if successful, you get a token returned that's valid. It says, yes, you're legit. This token is then sent in with your request to the API. So you have like a different server. This is your Twitter, Facebook, Google authentication server that plays a central role of authenticating you by providing you this valid token. OAuth tends to require some more explanation and so forth, but in your, let's say that you're using Dropbox, or your Dropbox technical writer, and they're like, yes, we use OAuth. Well, what does that documentation look like? Yeah, here we go. You might have a description about some workflow. You would never have to describe OAuth itself, like document how OAuth works, which is probably a magnitude times 1,000 more complex than what you'd want in your documentation. So I'm not able to scroll very smoothly here. But basically, you might describe what you need to put in the header, what token, what it's called, how you generate the token, how long it lasts, any kind of other details about it. As you might have that, right? And this is information you would get from your developers, your team. They would explain how it's authenticated, because as you're documenting these, you need to authenticate them yourself. You'll have to generate a token and do the same process. So it should be like complementary to your other endpoint request testing. And there's some other methods. There's another one called basic, but it's not worth getting into. All right, status and error codes. This is an area that is ripe for technical writers and communicators and strategists to insert themselves and provide value. When you submit a bad request, you get back an error code that usually tells you why the request was rejected or why it was bad. For example, 500 means there was some kind of error on the server. 403 means maybe you're not authorized for it. And in an ideal world, the error code should have some kind of helpful message that lets a user recover from this failure. If you have bad API keys or something, your error message should say, for more information about API keys, see this topic or something. I rarely see that done, partly because a lot of times these messages aren't readily discoverable. You have to go hunting for them. They're not part of the happy path, right? You have to try to break the API. When you test things, put in bad parameters, put in incorrect things, bad API keys, see what happens, and you can kind of compile these. You should also be able to tell your developers, hey, I want a list of all the status and error codes, and maybe you can even craft messages for them. Worst case scenario, they're just hard-coded into the different API code. Best case scenario, they're referenced in some nice maybe XML file or something that you can easily submit through a translation process. At any rate, let's take a look. Let's take a look at a couple of these. Oops. Clearbit. Okay. So because these errors are typically mostly the same for all your endpoints, they're often put on one page. But if they were specific to a particular endpoint, you could put it on that endpoint's reference page. But here, this person, this Clearbit docs, they're like, hey, 402 over quota, over plan quota on this endpoint. Maybe that's all that needs to be said. You could maybe say more. But they have a whole, this leads itself to a troubleshooting page. It's a very natural fit. And in other areas, I think a different example here, I think Twitter has a good troubleshooting. Yeah, they really have a lot to say. For example, 403, forbidden. It's not enough to just say, hey, it's a forbidden request. They actually explain it. They're like, we understood it, but you didn't have the right authorization. And here's something about update limits and other reasons. So this is a difference between good API documentation where you actually have a detailed error reason, troubleshooting, versus a bad API documentation set that might just say forbidden. I think you can really see a lot of the difference in this status and error codes. How many status and error codes are documented? Here's the enhance your calm one. I need to figure out how I do that to get my enhance my calm. What? I'm not sure if that's just a joke or not, but anyway. There's also a logic to these error codes. So all the 400 error codes are a certain type. Like you would never have successful responses that have 400s. Yeah, for the most part, if you have a 200, okay, there's not a lot to say about it, and it's a standard error code, then you're fine. But if you have a specific one that's unique to your API that you have something to say about, definitely jump in there.
So I have a question about in this case.
Yeah, what's your question?
We have the error codes. They have kind of the short description, the standard description. Then they have a longer description. But on some websites, they make them funny. So would you document that?
Wait, on some websites they make them funny? Wait, where?
Yeah, like you'll get the code, but then there will be a funny message.
It's not me, it's us.
Yeah, like that.
Oh, kind of like how people are playful with the 404 pages and they do all kinds of. So, you know, if you're in an environment where that kind of tone is allowed, I think that's awesome. I've been in so many places where, yeah, it's very like, you could never say that in the corporate voice. I don't really know. I would say go with it. I have no idea, really.
It would be okay to add another column here.
Sure.
The standard, and then your fun one.
Yeah. So you're saying, like, instead of like not found, you might have a jokey thing that's like, we're still looking for it or something, you know. Yeah, you might put them both there. I'm not really sure. That seems like a fun scenario, though. Like, of all the scenarios you'd have, that would be the least worrisome, and people usually welcome that.
Well,
Sort of.
I actually have a comment about
You
that.
do?
It depends
Okay.
on how widely used your API is. But don't make the assumption
Ah.
that your sense of humor matches another culture's sense of humor.
You're right. The translation, there may be some, like, for example, how does this 420 enhance your calm translate into Japanese? They maybe look at this and say, well, maybe they're like, oh, ha, ha, or maybe they're completely, like, confused. Good point. Yeah, humor's a whole other topic we could get into. For some reason in the developer doc space, humor seems to be allowed in third-party documentation and almost encouraged, especially in code comments. But all right, rate limiting and thresholds is another area. We talked about this briefly. This is part of the reason for API keys. You want to restrict how many calls people can make. They often have plans around, like a pro plan has 10,000 calls per day. If you get more than 10,000 visits on your website, and each time your website loads, it makes a call, you start to see how it works. These thresholds are often defined by marketing and other people in the business side. They may not always be known info to developers and may not be applicable to put that in your docs. You don't want to say, after 10,000 calls per day, you're charged an extra 2 cents per call. I mean, that's not a documentation sort of thing, unless that sort of merges the pricing and the docs together. But you should know, and a lot of times if you do surpass the threshold, people start to throttle you, and suddenly it's very slow, right? You've experienced this, no doubt, with internet. And same with developers. If suddenly, if they've gone past the limit, and now the call takes 5 seconds to return, and their whole website is slow, this is something they need to know. This is a danger they don't want to run into. All right. Code samples and tutorials are another. This is a sort of general area, but you'll need this in some way or another. Your API will need some kind of tutorial, like, for example, with Flickr. Let's say you wanted to return a list of of images from a gallery in Flickr. Well, it's not so straightforward how to do that. Like first you have to make one request and you get the response from that request and you pair it with another request and then you assemble the responses from these requests into some other code to display on your page. And if you just look at the reference, you're not gonna, it's not gonna be intuitive. So your endpoints may have specific workflows. You just a straight list of them grouped by tags isn't enough. You explain how you actually use these endpoints in real business scenarios. And probably the hands down most interesting example of this is on Twilio. They've got these quick start things. First of all, they have some amazing filtering on the left, but disregarding that, let's say you're trying to do some kind of SMS messaging quick start. First of all, you can pick your language. So let's do it in Node. And it's an out, whatever. Once you get down to the bottom, they have like another section that expands up. You get down to this section, expand up, and they kind of walk you through it line by line. This is another example of good documentation, right? An actual tutorial on how to use the service, the API. And it's sort of fascinating to see that. I don't know, I mean, I'm not a Twilio user, so I don't know if it's good, but it seems good. MailChimp is another great example. These guys don't assume anything. They really make sure that you understand basic API concepts and walk you through this whole process. But here, this is how you manage subscribers, right? They don't just say, oh, you manage subscribers with the subscriber endpoint and go figure it out. No, it's like, before you start, think about this. You're going to need to identify your subscribers. You need to check the subscription status. Now you subscribe to the address, and here's the code and so forth. So it really walks you through this from beginning to end. And that is what is missing in a lot of docs, is this end-to-end process for how to do something. Too often developers just dump the reference docs on you. Here's the Swagger file. It's all obvious because I've been developing and designing this for over a year. And users are just not really sure on the way to go. So
what's the difference between doing that and doing something like swim lane diagram?
You mean this versus a swim lane diagram? I'm a big fan of flowcharts, and so if you have like some kind of navigation map arranged in a swim lane that makes sense, sure. I love that kind of stuff. I have let me do a quick aside here. In one of my docs, I'm really a big fan of these flowcharts, so I'll show you what I implemented for one product. So, beginning to end process. I have all these different maps and these journeys, and let's say you're just getting set up. I like to embed this at the top of each page that walks you through it. I mean, some people have it all on one page and so forth, but I like this map that guides you through a larger system. I think it's totally appropriate in scenarios that are tutorial based like this. It's really where tech writers shine, because developers, they don't like to write this, they're not good at it, and we can really add a lot of value there. People implement this same kind of thing in a lot of different ways. This is very static. If you have swim lanes, you probably have more complex branching and more sophisticated ways to show the logic through a system. And you probably have tools for doing that, even if it's just an image. Okay. This is a brief quote about what makes good API docs. While a developer's guide should walk a developer through the basic usage of an API and its functionality, it can't cover every possible use of an API in a coherent way. That is where articles and tutorials come in, to teach developers tangential or specialized uses of an API, like combining it with another service, framework, or API. This is from the 6 pillars of complete developer documentation. It's kind of like preaching to the choir here, because we're all like, yeah, of course you need that, but a lot of developers, they don't think like that. And when you look around for API platform hosting, A lot of them just show the reference content, like no non-reference tutorial content, as if that's all a developer needs. So. Okay, now probably the most challenging one, SDKs and sample apps. I described what an SDK is earlier, software development kit. This accompanies an API, and it's in a specific language. Like, you may have an Android SDK that implements your API for Android phones. You may have a Java SDK or Node.js app, and you'll often be asked to publish these and create documentation for them. And this is where it gets really nerve-wracking, because you may be like, well, I don't know Android, I don't know Java, I don't know Node. And now you've got this SDK that's this jumble of files, and the developer says, well, somebody who is a Java developer is going to know how to use this, because they know Java. So you just have to just put it out there, put a link to it, right? You're like, something sounds faulty about that, but this is where it becomes very challenging. Fortunately, there's kind of a middle point. Obviously, you don't have to just throw yourself into Android and figure it all out and like 8 months later say, okay, yeah, this looks good, or no, we need this. Generally, you provide instructions on how to start the thing. Like with Android, you may say, here's how you launch this sample app, or how you use the SDK in a very minimum way to get people started, because you do expect that they're going to know Android. Or you may have developers writing the documentation around this, but you would want to go through and, at a minimum, see if you can make it work a little bit. It's usually a standard I try to impose. I'm like, okay, I know you've got it all set up, but let me see if I can make it work. So when I worked at a company that had an Android SDK, I was like, look, I don't really even know how I'm supposed to get this SDK launched. And they're like, oh, you download Android Studio, and then you have this virtual device in there. And they walked me through, and then I could see it. But it generally is something that is very common. Let's look at an example here. How about CityGrid? You can see they've got PHP code samples, basic information about like how you get to it. A lot of times, if it's a sample app, you want to have the comments in line in the code in there. So a lot of times developers will write that. I guess that doesn't show a whole lot. Amazon, this is the AWS side. They tend to have really good documentation. And they've got whole projects about how you get going in these. Anyway, all right. Questions? Okay. The quick reference. This again is going above and beyond. Like I said before, not all API docs have these, but if you do have a quick reference, it's a sign of a good API doc set. A quick reference just shows one-liners about what are the endpoints, or it's usually the endpoints, a quick summary of things. Here's an example from Eventful. They have sort of an index page that says, here's all our methods, and you can quickly see which one you want, right? If you are really design savvy, you could even implement something like this. This is from Shopify. It's not really an API, but it's for developers. And they even have little toggles here. This is just JavaScript. It's kind of brilliant. They've got a lot of information here. It's trying to be comprehensive, and maybe it is, but certainly impressive. All right. Another example is best practices. A lot of times, and this is API best practices. There may be things that are just specific to your API that developers will want to know. It could be stuff about pagination, time ranges, fault tolerance, cache values, connectivity. There are lots of different topics that could be related here. And they're not standard. It's not like every API needs best practices around fault tolerance. But if your API does have some topics, your documentation would cover these. You would ask your developers, what are some best practices with the API? Are there any gotchas, problems where people are gonna stumble, things I need to call out? And there usually is, but it's not like the same for everybody. Another above and beyond measure is to provide a glossary. In case you haven't noticed, there's a million different terms in this space, and not everybody has consistency. The good sites actually define things. This is immensely helpful for translation as well. In fact, it's usually required. But here's the Lyft glossary. They're defining kind of their terms. I didn't realize Lyft actually had all these options. But they add them. So, if you've got terms, and you usually do, add a glossary. Okay, and finally, the FAQ. A lot of people have conflicting feelings about an FAQ. In bad documentation shops, what happens is people start out writing documentation as an FAQ, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's like 20 pages, and then they call in a technical writer to try to organize it. But hopefully the FAQ is just a brief highlight of really what the most frequently asked questions are, with a link to more details in a regular documentation organization. All right, so those are 11 points. Probably not like revelatory or super surprising, but does anybody have any questions about any of those? Because I have one last activity I want us to do.
Where do business cases or use case scenarios fall under?
Use case scenarios?
Or business cases?
Huh. I would think in that overview page, like, who is the API used for, maybe?
Okay.
Yeah. I think that would be great to add that kind of information. Like, who is it for? What are some sample scenarios?
It's good for tutorials too, right? I mean, you can take one of those and make a tutorial out of it.
Yeah. Okay, here's our last activity. And we didn't have any activities specifically related to the non-reference docs. But this comes back to a question actually that you were asking. How do you kind of put your content back in the source flow? And the activity I want us to do is the GitHub workflow. This is a common way that you will interact with information that might be in the developer's domain. Or if you have a Docs as Code workflow or something, you may be using Git. But it's pretty common in this space to understand like how you clone something, how you push, pull, branch, commit, and all. And raise your hand if you're totally familiar with Git. Well, I shouldn't say totally. Raise your hand if you've worked with Git and are familiar with Git. So only about a third of the people. All right, and for the other people, it may be new. Okay. So here's what we're going to do, just kind of to get you going. Go to github.com. You're going to create a sample repository. You're going to clone the repository locally, make a change, and push the update back to the repository. If you can do that, then you can participate in workflows where you may need to go into the source code and make changes to a sample app, for example. That's probably the best example, really, that relates to non-reference docs. You want to correct the comments in the source, or if you have the scenario you described where they're code annotating in the source. All right, so if you're at github.com and are logged in, you should see a little plus button in the upper right. Click it and choose New Repository. And don't do this step too quickly because you need to initialize it with something, otherwise it's more complicated. So put something like Denver Workshop Test or something. Type anything for the description, and in the initialize with a README, select that box. The git ignore place basically says these are the types of files that I'm not going to include in the repository, even if they're in the same directory that you're tracking. So if you had a Jekyll project, for example, it will automatically add all the stuff. It doesn't really matter what you put there. And you can choose a license, choose MIT for fun. So once you have this configured, let me know. I don't want to lose anybody here. OK, we're good? OK, you're going to click Create Repository. And it should take you right into the repository settings. If you're fortunate enough to actually have access to GitHub to manage your content, your sample apps, whatever other code you have, it's great. OK, once you have that, click the green button and choose and copy the clone, copy to clipboard. You want to copy this thing, right? You can do it manually or click this. Are we all there? Anybody lost? Because usually this is where the technical glitches happen. So that's why I saved it to the end. Come into Terminal, and let me just create a new tab there. Make that visible. OK. By default, your computer usually puts you in your own user directory. So you could navigate to where you want. But we'll just assume you're where you want to be. Type git space clone and then paste the URL, just like that. Git clone. What cloning means is it's copying it. It's making a copy. Why we say clone instead of copy, I'm not actually sure. And then hit return.
So did you click a button so that you ended up at projects? Because I copied that thing, and then I went to my command line terminal, which doesn't look like yours.
Yeah, well, you're on a PC, so it's going to be different. But oh.
It doesn't say projects. Did you add that?
Oh yeah, no. I set it as my default directory, which don't worry. Whatever your default directory is probably fine. My default is usually Tom JOHT or something.
So just go to the terminal and paste.
Yeah, and in Windows you may have to do right-click paste or something to paste it. Yeah, the terminal experience on Mac and Linux is much better than on Windows. I think there's some better Windows apps. There's one I think called Terminal. And then there's the whole PowerShell side of things. But anyway.
So paste it and press enter.
And you should see something like this, that it clones the project. So let's pretend this is a sample SDK that you've cloned. You want to go and fix the comments in the source. To get into, you could now find this using Finder or whatever. I believe if you type open dot, it's going to open the current directory. In Windows, I believe you type Explorer, and it will do the same thing. But here it is shown me the folder where it is. You could just manually find it. Denver workshops, all right? So, wow, that's getting small. Open up the README, make a change, and then we're going to push it back. So right-click, open it up in something like Sublime. This is a change. Click Save. All right. Pause here. So basically, wherever the file got cloned, the project got cloned, go there, whether you have to navigate with your GUI tools or if you just click open it directly there from command line. Make a change to the README, click Save, and then go back to your command line and let me know when everybody's there. OK. From here, and by the way, there are all kinds of Git tutorials. I'm not trying to teach you Git. I'm just trying to demonstrate the workflow that would be used. You would type git add, and you could just put dot to make it simple. Dot means pretty much everything in the directory. Or you could do -all, but I like dot. So git add dot, and that's going to, oh, whoops, I'm not in the Git repository, sorry. You got to change into the place where it cloned it, CD. OK, so CD means change directory, and it works on Windows or Mac, Unix, or Windows. Then git.add. Then follow that by git commit-m, and just something like my first commit, like that. Hit return, and then do git push. And you'll probably be prompted for your credentials. There's a way to store that as a cache so you're not prompted. Then you should be able to go back to your Git repository, reload your README, and see the change. So if you're successful, if you have been able to do that. And when you are successful with that, raise your hand. Let me know.
Can you go back, because
Yeah. Okay, so
Thank you.
it was, I think I actually have this in the workshop description somewhere. Git add dot, git commit dash m space question mark, some message, git push. And then you'll probably have to enter your GitHub credentials, which is like your username. Mine is Tom JOHT, that kind of thing. A lot of times, if you're working with a development team, a good way to get the inside scoop of what they're doing is to look at their commit logs, because they don't do anything without describing what they're doing. The developers are very structured about how they add commit messages and how they track things. So it can be a way, the more familiar you become with Git, the more powerful it is as you interact with developers and working with their code, as well as adding your own comments in there. How many people successfully updated their README on there? 2? Man, 3? Okay. It's probably the people who already know Git backwards and forwards. So.
Still sending user email and name.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it would prompt you for just your credentials rather than requiring you to do all the other stuff. At any rate, there's plenty of Git tutorials, and very commonly what you'll do is maybe branch something and then create a pull request to have it merged into the code. Nobody will probably give you rights to commit directly into the master branch if they're developers, but that is the general interaction workflow. All right, we are coming to a close. It's 1:27. Are there questions or other topics that you feel we should have addressed or talked about that we didn't, that either feedback for next time or just more information? Are you guys tired? Or are you man, I still have most of my Saturday?
Seriously, thanks. This has been eye-opening.
Oh, good. There's plenty of information on the site that will take you through it in more depth. There's also great tutorials by Peter Gruenbaum on Udemy, if you prefer video, and other resources. But feel free to follow up with questions. If you do email me, tell me you were in the workshop so that I know. I do get a million questions from all kinds of people asking things. Yeah, in closing, let me just say that this is a good space to be in. Somebody commented the other day, on Tech World, they did a review of my site, which was a little weird. And somebody was saying that they sort of lamented the fact that I had gone into a different direction with API docs, and they missed some of my blogs about good old regular technical writing. And I was like, are they really different? I thought it was just kind of sort of the same effort, just a little different focus. And maybe it is a different world. Maybe this API doc space is substantially different, and there's from the tools to the workflow to the content types, the structure. Maybe it's really the comment has merit. It's substantially different. But when you learn to navigate that world, you are empowered. And market-wise, there's tremendous potential. Learning-wise, there's a never-ending opportunity to just get more and more technical. And it can be fun because it's so hands-on with all the requests. So thanks again for coming. And
Thanks a lot, Tom.
yeah.